The gunshot cracked across the valley like thunder splitting open the sky, and Eleanor Whitfield fell to her knees in the mud, screaming a name that wasn't her fiancé's. 3 days earlier, she had stood on the porch of the Whitfield ranch house in a white lace dress that wasn't hers to choose, staring at a stranger with dust on his boots and a kindness in his eyes that no amount of money could buy. She hadn't known his name yet. She hadn't known that in 72 hours, she would be kneeling in a field with blood soaking through her skirts, begging God to let him live. She hadn't known that loving him would cost her everything she thought she wanted, and give her everything she never knew she needed. This is the story of a promise made out of duty, and a promise made out of love, and the woman who had to choose between them before the sun went down on a Colorado spring in 1887. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you won't just remember Eleanor and the cowboy who loved her. You'll remember what it means to choose your own heart, even when the whole world has already decided for you. The town of Larkspur Creek sat in a green bowl of Colorado hills, ringed by aspen groves that turned gold every autumn and buried under snow every winter. And in the spring, when the story begins, it smelled of wet earth and turned soil, and the particular hope that only April brings to a mountain town waking up from a long, hard freeze. Eleanor Whitfield was 23 years old, and she had been promised to Harlan Voss since she was 17. It hadn't been her choice. It rarely was, for women of her station in that time and place. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, but 2 years of drought and a bad investment in a silver mine that never paid out had left the ranch drowning in debt. Harlan Voss's father owned the bank that held that debt, and Harlan Voss, at 29, was a man who collected things the way other men collected pocket watches, with precision, with pride, and with no particular tenderness for what those things felt about being collected. Eleanor had grown up watching her mother iron her father's shirts with the same careful, joyless efficiency that she now recognized in her own future. She had grown up believing that love was a luxury afforded to women whose fathers weren't drowning in debt, to men whose sons had cruel, patient eyes. She had grown up learning to fold herself smaller and smaller, the way you'd fold a letter you never intended to send, until the folding became so natural she forgot there had ever been a version of her that took up more space. The wedding was set for June. It was April when Jesse Cole rode into Larkspur Creek with nothing but a tired horse, a canvas bedroll, and a letter in his breast pocket from a man who'd died before Jesse could reach him. He wasn't looking for trouble, and he certainly wasn't looking for love. Jesse Cole had spent the last 6 years drifting between cattle drives and ranch work from Texas to Wyoming, chasing the kind of freedom that men chase when they've buried too many people to trust in staying anywhere too long. His mother had died when he was 12. His father, a horse trainer named Silas Cole, had raised him alone on hard work and harder silence, and had died just 2 months before this story begins, leaving Jesse a letter that asked him to deliver a small wooden box to a man named Thomas Whitfield in a town called Larkspur Creek, an old debt, the letter said, from a kindness Thomas had done Silas 30 years before, back when they were young men chasing the same dream in the same direction. So Jesse came to deliver a box and settle his father's memory, and instead he found himself standing at the base of the porch steps of the Whitfield ranch house, hat in his hands, looking up at a woman in a plain blue work dress with flour on her wrists and sunlight caught in loose strands of her dark hair, and something in his chest went as still and as certain as a compass needle finding north. "I'm looking for Thomas Whitfield," he said. "That's my father," Eleanor answered, wiping her hands on her apron, studying the stranger with the kind of open curiosity she'd trained herself, over 6 years of engagement to Harlan Voss, never to show a man. "He's out with the herd. Should be back by supper." "I can wait," Jesse said, and something about the plainness of it, the lack of any performance in it, made Eleanor's mouth twitch toward a smile she immediately smothered. "Suit yourself," she said, and went back inside. But she watched him from the kitchen window for the better part of an hour, watched him unsaddle his horse without being asked, water it at the trough, then sit himself down on the porch steps and go still in a way that reminded her of the mountains themselves, patient and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and no particular need to fill it with noise. Thomas Whitfield came home to find a stranger on his porch and left 2 hours later with tears standing unashamed in his eyes, holding a small wooden box that contained his own father's pocket watch, a debt from decades past, repaid at last through the son of the man who'd once saved Thomas Whitfield's life on a cattle drive gone wrong along the Cimarron River. Thomas insisted Jesse stay for supper. Supper became a week. A week became something neither Eleanor nor Jesse dared to name, because naming it would have made it real, and real was dangerous when you were a woman with a wedding date already carved into June and a man with nothing to offer but a tired horse and a name nobody in 3 counties had ever heard. They didn't fall in love in a single moment, the way stories sometimes claim. It happened the way spring happens in the mountains, slowly, and then all at once. It happened in the mornings when Jesse helped mend fences alongside the ranch hands, and Eleanor brought water out to the men at midday and lingered 3 minutes longer at his post than at any other. It happened in the evenings when he'd sit near enough to the porch that she could hear him humming old trail songs under his breath while he oiled his saddle leather, and she'd find some reason, mending, shelling peas, anything, to sit within earshot. It happened in 100 small moments neither of them chose exactly, and both of them chose completely. By the 3rd week, Eleanor knew 2 things with equal certainty, and the 2 things were tearing her apart. She knew that she loved Jesse Cole with a fullness and a terror she had never once felt in 6 years of being promised to Harlan Voss. And she knew that her father's ranch, the land, the cattle, the roof over her mother's head, the future of her 2 younger brothers, depended entirely on the marriage that Dad had arranged. It was on an evening in early May, with the aspens just beginning to leaf out gold green against a sky the color of a healing bruise, that Jesse finally said what he'd been carrying since the first morning he saw her at the top of those porch steps. Eleanor. He'd never used her given name before. It landed between them like a struck match. I know what I am and what I'm not. I've got no ranch, no bank account, nothing but a horse and 2 hands that know how to work. I know you're set to marry a man who can give you everything I can't. Jesse, don't. I'm not asking you to leave him, he said quickly, though the words seemed to cost him something physical to say. I'm not fool enough to think I've got any right to ask you that. I just needed you to know, before I ride out of here, that in 3 weeks I have come to love you more than I've loved anything in this world, and I don't expect that to change one thing about your life. I just couldn't leave without you knowing it was true. Eleanor stood on that porch with her heart breaking open like a dropped plate, and she said the words that would haunt the rest of this story. I'm already promised, Jesse. It isn't a thing I get to undo. And Jesse Cole, this quiet, sun-worn cowboy who had buried both his parents and crossed 4 states with nothing but a horse and a letter, looked at her with an ache so plain and unguarded that she felt it in her own chest like a second heartbeat. And he said the words that gave this story its name. That doesn't stop my heart. He didn't ask her to run. He didn't make promises he had no power to keep. He simply told her the truth and let her carry the weight of what to do with it. Because Jesse Cole, for all his poverty, understood something that Harlan Voss, for all his money, never had. That love without honesty is just another kind of ownership, and Jesse had spent his whole life refusing to own anything he hadn't earned. That night, Eleanor lay awake until the sky outside her window went from black to gray to the pale gold of dawn, and by the time the sun came up over the eastern ridge, she understood that the promise she'd made at 17 and the promise growing wild and unbidden in her chest at 23 could not both survive the summer. One of them was going to have to die for the other to live. She just didn't yet know which one, or what it would cost her to find out. Word travels fast in a small town, and word of a drifter lingering too long at the Whitfield ranch traveled fastest of all straight to Harlan Voss. Harlan rode out on a Sunday afternoon in the last week of May, dressed in a gray suit too fine for ranch dust, and he found Jesse Cole in the barn reshoeing one of Thomas Whitfield's horses, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat on his brow, entirely unbothered by the arrival of the man whose fiancée he had fallen in love with. "You're the drifter," Harlan said, in the flat voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Name's Jesse Cole," Jesse answered, not looking up from the hoof in his lap. "I know who you are. I know what you've been doing here." Harlan's voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that men use instead of shouting because they've learned that quiet frightens people more. Eleanor Whitfield is promised to me. Her father's debt is held by my father's bank. You understand what that means? Or is that too complicated for a man who sleeps on the ground? Jesse set the horse's hoof down gently and finally looked up, and there was no fear in his face, only a tired, sorrowful clarity. I understand it means you can take a man's land if he can't pay you. I understand it means you can hold a debt over a family until they hand you their daughter like she's part of the herd. What I don't understand, Mr. Voss, is how a man can call that love. Harlan's jaw tightened. You'll be gone by morning, or I'll call in the Whitfield debt in full, and I'll have the sheriff escort your worthless carcass out of this county myself. It wasn't an idle threat. Everyone in Larkspur Creek knew that Elias Voss, Harlan's father, held enough paper on enough ranches in the valley that his word carried more weight than the sheriff's badge. Jesse understood, standing in that barn, that his presence in Eleanor's life was no longer a private ache between two hearts. It had become a weapon that could destroy her entire family. That night, Jesse made the hardest decision of his life. He packed his bedroll, saddled his horse before first light, and left a note for Eleanor with her younger brother Daniel, a boy of 11 who idolized him and cried when Jesse pressed a silver dollar into his palm and asked him to wait until sunrise to deliver it. The note said simply, I won't be the reason your family loses everything. Loving you was never about taking something from you. It was about wanting you to have everything you deserved, even if that isn't me. Be well, Eleanor. My heart rides with you wherever I go. Eleanor read that note on her porch steps at dawn with her whole body shaking, and something in her, some final wall she'd spent 6 years reinforcing, collapsed all at once. She understood, reading Jesse's handwriting, blocky and plain and utterly without artifice, that she had spent her entire adult life mistaking obligation for inevitability. She had told herself the marriage to Harlan was simply what happened to girls like her, the way weather simply happens, the way winter simply comes. But Jesse's letter reminded her of something she'd buried so deep she'd nearly forgotten it, that a promise made by a 17-year-old girl under her father's debt was not a law of nature. It was a choice, and choices, unlike weather, could be unmade. She found her father in the stable an hour later, and she told him everything, about Jesse, about the note, about 6 years of swallowing her own wants like bitter medicine because she believed her family's survival depended on it. Thomas Whitfield, who had wept 2 weeks earlier holding his own father's pocket watch, listened to his daughter with a grief-heavy silence, and when she finished, he said the words she had never once let herself hope to hear. Eleanor, I would rather lose this ranch to the bank than watch you become your mother. His voice cracked on the last word. I made a bargain with Elias Voss because I was scared and I was proud, and I told myself it was the only way to protect this family. But I never meant for it to cost you your whole life. Go, find him. I'll deal with Voss. And that is how Eleanor Whitfield came to be riding hard across open range on a borrowed horse in the late afternoon light, chasing a cowboy who had a full day's head start and no idea she was coming. And how, 3 miles outside town, she came upon Harlan Voss and 2 of his father's hired men blocking the road where it crossed a shallow creek, having ridden out that very morning to make certain Jesse Cole left the county for good, and to make certain of it with more than words. What happened next happened fast, the way real danger always does, too fast for fear, too fast for anything but instinct. Harlan had drawn a pistol, not to kill, he would later claim, only to frighten, but Jesse, arriving at that same crossing from the opposite direction, saw a gun leveled in the vicinity of the woman he loved and did the only thing his body would allow. He spurred his horse between them. The shot that rang out across the valley struck Jesse Cole in the shoulder, and he fell from his horse into the mud at the creek's edge, and Eleanor Whitfield screamed his name for the entire valley to hear and flung herself from her own saddle to kneel beside him with her hands pressed hard against the wound, sobbing his name over and over, as if repetition alone could keep him tethered to the earth. It was Harlan Voss himself, staring down at what his fear and his pride had done, who finally broke, not from conscience alone, but from the plain, undeniable sight of a woman who loved a dying man more completely than she had ever once looked at him in 6 years of engagement. He sent his men for the doctor. He did not try to stop Eleanor from riding beside Jesse's wagon into town, her bloodied hand still pressed to his shoulder the whole way, whispering to him not to leave her, not now. not when she'd finally found the courage to choose him. Jesse Cole did not die that day. The bullet had struck muscle, not bone, and Dr. Halloway of Larkspur Creek was skilled enough and swift enough to save him. Though the fever that followed kept Eleanor at his bedside for 3 days and 3 nights, during which she barely slept, barely ate, and never once let go of his hand. On the 4th morning, Jesse's fever broke, and he opened his eyes to find Eleanor asleep in a chair beside his bed, her hand still wrapped around his, dark circles beneath her eyes and dried tears on her cheeks. And he understood, in that quiet golden morning light, that whatever came next in his life, he had already received more than he'd ever thought a man like him was owed. Harlan Voss called off the engagement himself before Eleanor ever had to say the words. Whether it was shame or conscience or simply the recognition that he had never once possessed her heart and never would, he rode to the Whitfield ranch a week later and released Eleanor from her promise in front of her father, and, in a gesture that surprised the entire county, forgave a portion of the Whitfield debt outright, perhaps as penance, perhaps as the last honest thing he did in this story. Thomas Whitfield spent the following 2 years working off the remainder honestly, without a daughter's marriage as collateral, and slept easier for it despite the harder years of labor it cost him. Jesse Cole stayed in Larkspur Creek. He took work training horses, the trade his father had taught him, and within 3 years he had built a small herd and a smaller house on a modest parcel of land at the edge of the Whitfield ranch, close enough that Eleanor could still see the smoke from his chimney from her bedroom window every winter morning. They married in the same June month originally set aside for her wedding to Harlan, but a full year later, under the same aspen trees that had been budding gold green the spring Jesse first rode into town, and this time the promise Eleanor made was entirely, fiercely her own. She wore her mother's old wedding dress instead of anything new, because by then she had learned that the things worth the most were rarely the things that cost the most. And when the preacher asked if she took this man, Eleanor Whitfield, soon to be Eleanor Cole, did not hesitate for even a single heartbeat, because for the first time in her life, the promise she was making was not a debt being paid on someone else's behalf. It was a gift, freely given, to a man who had once told her, with nothing to his name but a tired horse and an honest heart, that her being promised to another didn't stop his heart from loving her anyway, and who had proven, with his own blood in the Colorado mud, that some hearts mean exactly what they say. They raised 3 children on that land. Jesse never did become a wealthy man, not by the measure Harlan Voss would have recognized, but he became something Eleanor had never once dared to hope for growing up beneath the weight of her father's debts. A husband who asked for nothing but her honest heart, and who gave his own so completely that she never again had to wonder, not for one single day of her life, whether she was loved for who she truly was. And that, in the end, is the whole of the lesson this story leaves behind, that the promises made for us by fear, by duty, by circumstances beyond our choosing, are not the promises that have to define our lives. The truest promise is the one we make freely, with open eyes and an open heart, to the person who loves us not for what we can offer, but simply for who we are. Eleanor Whitfield spent 6 years believing her heart belonged to a debt she never chose. It took one quiet cowboy and the courage to finally choose herself to teach her that a heart, a real, true heart, cannot be promised away by anyone but the person who owns it.